groaned under Sarah's boots, a sound like grinding teeth in the oppressive silence of the foyer. The air inside the house was thick, tasting of stagnant dust and something sharper, metallic, like the scent of a copper coin held too long in a sweaty palm. "Okay," Rachel whispered, her voice bouncing off the peeling wallpaper. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her bravado finally beginning to fray at the edges. "I think we've proven it's haunted. Can we go now?" The floor in the kitchen was literally breathing. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the wall. A massive, floor-to-ceiling mirror framed in rotted mahogany dominated the hallway. It didn't reflect the room behind them accurately. The image in the glass seemed to lag, a heartbeat behind reality. When Sarah stepped forward, her reflection took a moment longer to mimic her stride. "Sarah? Did you hear me?" Rachel grabbed her friend's arm, her grip tighter than necessary. "This place is wrong. The whole damn island is wrong." "Look at the carvings," Sarah murmured, ignoring the prickle of static climbing her spine. She pointed toward the baseboards, where intricate, spiraling symbols had been etched into the wood, not with a knife, but seemingly burned in. They pulsed with a faint, sickly amber light, a rhythm that synchronized perfectly with the distant, thumping sound they had heard outside. "These aren't local legends, Ratch. This is architecture. It's like the house is designed to hold something." They moved deeper, passing into what might have once been a parlor. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, but the shapes underneath were wrong. They weren't chairs or tables, they were tall, spindly things that looked more like cages or iron maidens. Rachel's flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against an encroaching darkness that felt physical, a velvet weight pressing against their skin. She swung the light toward a heavy, wrought iron pedestal in the center of the room. Atop it sat a bowl carved from a material that looked like obsidian but felt warm to the touch. Inside, a dark, viscous liquid pooled, viscous and deep, reflecting no light. "Is that oil?" Rachel asked, though her voice betrayed her hope. Sarah reached out, her finger hovering inches from the surface. The liquid rippled, though there was no draft. A sudden, sharp realization hit her, a gut-wrenching, cold clarity. "It's not oil, Ratch. It's blood. It's fresh." The house groaned. It wasn't the house settling, it was a rhythmic contraction of the foundation, a sound of heavy, ancient masonry shifting. The front door, which they had pushed open only moments ago, slammed shut with the finality of a guillotine blade. There was no latch, no handle, just smooth, seamless wood where the exit had been. "Oh God," Rachel backed away, her breath hitching. "Sarah, the door. It's gone." "Don't panic," Sarah said, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She spun around, scanning the parlor. There has to be another way out. Kitchen windows, the back cellar. "No," Rachel hissed, pointing toward the ceiling. "Do you hear that?" From the level above, a sound emerged. It wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of something dragging, heavy, wet, and deliberate. Slap. Drag. Slap. Drag. It sounded like a butcher's apron being pulled across a slab of cold marble. Sarah moved to the staircase, her hand gripping the banister. It felt sticky, coated in a fine, drying residue. As she climbed, the house seemed to protest. The stairs grew steeper, the wood warping under their feet like soft clay. The temperature plummeted. Her breath turned into a frantic plume of mist, and the smell of rot intensified, overwhelming and dizzying. "We shouldn't be here," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide, reflecting the terror Sarah felt blossoming in her own chest. "We were just supposed to take a photo. Just a joke for the group chat. We shouldn't have crossed the water." "I know," Sarah said, her voice strained. She reached the landing and peered into the shadows of the attic. The attic was vast, a cavernous space filled with the detritus of a century of misery. Broken mannequins, rusted instruments of torture, and piles of discarded, yellowing clothes lay scattered everywhere. In the center of the room, a singular, ornate velvet chair faced the window overlooking the lake. A figure sat there, back turned to them. The man was tall, his frame lean and predatory. As the floorboards creaked under Sarah's weight, the figure didn't turn, but his head tilted with an unnatural, bone-cracking fluidity. "Trespassers," the man said. His voice was melodic, smooth as silk, and utterly devoid of warmth. He stood, his movements possessing a grace that made the hair on Sarah's neck stand up. "You come to the house, but you do not understand the appetite of the walls." The man turned. His hair was a shock of vibrant, arterial red, standing out like a fresh wind against the gloom. His eyes were not human, they were pits of burning, hungry gold. "Run," Sarah breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. "It is far too late for that, little bird," the man replied. He took one step, and he was no longer 10 feet away. He was right in front of them, his presence filling the attic with a suffocating, ancient dread. Rachel screamed, a jagged sound that died instantly as the man moved. He was a blur of motion, a shadow detached from the light. He grabbed Rachel by the hair, dragging her back with a strength that suggested he could shatter bone as easily as parchment. "Rachel!" Sarah lunged, fueled by an adrenaline-fueled fury, but the red-haired man backhanded her with a force that sent her crashing into a pile of wooden crates. Pain exploded in her shoulder, blinding and hot. She struggled to sit up, her vision swimming. Through the haze, she saw him, the vampire, pinning Rachel against the rafters. He leaned in, his lips pulling back to reveal fangs that glistened with a sickening, wet sheen. "No!" Sarah shrieked, scrambling to her feet, her hands clawing for anything, a shard of glass, a rusted pipe, anything to stop the nightmare. The vampire didn't even look at her. He simply arched his back and plunged his teeth into the soft, pale skin of Rachel's neck. The sound was distinct, a wet, tearing crunch that Sarah would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. Rachel's body went rigid. Her eyes flew wide, fixed on the ceiling, as a spasm of agony racked her frame. Her hands clawed uselessly at the man's shoulders, leaving long, bloody furrows in his coat. Then, abruptly, the fight left her. She went limp, held up only by the vampire's crushing grip. Sarah froze. The world narrowed down to the dripping blood, the pulsing, amber light of the floorboards, and the absolute, hollow realization that everything she knew had just ended. The vampire pulled back, a thin trail of crimson sliding down his chin, and looked at Sarah. He smiled, and for the first time, she saw the hunger, not just for blood, but for something much, much darker. He dropped Rachel's body like a discarded doll. Sarah didn't think. She didn't bargain. She turned, her boots slipping on the slick wood, and sprinted for the stairs. Behind her, the vampire laughed, a low, melodic sound that echoed through the house, inviting her to run, knowing full well she had nowhere left to go. The attic was a stagnant lung of the house, heavy with the smell of rotted cedar and something metallic, like copper pennies left to dissolve in vinegar. Sarah's flashlight beam cut a nervous, jittery path through the dark, illuminating dust motes that danced like ghosts in the stagnant air. Rachel was 3 paces ahead, her hand hovering over a trunk bound in rusted iron straps. She turned back, her smile forced, a pale sliver of light catching the nervous sheen of sweat on her upper lip. "I'm telling you, Sar," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic groaning of the floorboards. "This isn't just squatters. People don't leave things like this behind." She gestured to the wall. Nailed into the joists were dozens of small, woven effigies made of black twine and bird bone. They weren't just curious junk, they were precise. Arranged in a radial symmetry that made Sarah's head throb with an immediate, sickening vertigo. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah muttered, her skin crawling. The playfulness of their hike across the lake had curdled into a cold, leaden weight in her stomach. "Rachel, look at the symbols. This looks intentional." "We just take one photo for the blog," Rachel replied, though her bravado was fraying. She reached for the trunk's latch. "One photo, and we leave." I want to know what's inside. The latch snapped open with the sound of a breaking bone. Before the lid could even hinge back, the shadows in the far corner of the attic detached themselves from the architecture. They didn't move like men, they flowed, a liquid darkness stretching and thickening until it solidified into a silhouette of terrifying grace. The light from Sarah's phone caught him. He was lean, wearing a coat of weathered wool that looked like it had been shredded by centuries of brambles. But it was his hair, an impossible, vibrant, blood-slick red, that stood out against the gray gloom of the attic. "The light is so harsh," the figure murmured. His voice was a rasp, smooth and serrated like a razor drawn over silk. Rachel spun around, her flashlight shaking so violently the beam swung wildly across the walls. "Who are you?" "This is private property." The man didn't answer. He simply tilted his head, his eyes reflecting the beam with the predatory, dull luminescence of a wolf. "Run," Sarah breathed, but the warning died in her throat as the man vanished. He didn't walk. He was simply there, an atmospheric shift in pressure that shoved the air out of the room. He slammed into Rachel with the force of a wrecking ball. The impact was sickening, a dull, wet thud followed by the sharp crack of wood as Rachel was thrown against the rafters. "Rachel!" Sarah lunged forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She grabbed a heavy, iron-bound ledger from a nearby table and swung it with all the desperate strength of a frightened animal. The man caught her wrist with a hand that felt like a cold, steel vice. His grip wasn't just strong, it was absolute. He pulled her close, his face inches from hers. Up close, the smell was overwhelming, the iron of blood, the musk of damp earth, and the faint, haunting scent of a graveyard after a storm. His skin was translucent, tracing veins of black ink that pulsed beneath his jaw. "Such fire," he hissed, his lips pulling back to reveal elongated, needle-thin teeth that glimmered in the dim light. "You'll make a spectacular addition." He didn't strike her, he shoved her aside, sending her tumbling into a stack of old crates that splintered under her weight. Sarah gasped, clutching her bruised ribs, her vision swimming. She turned, panic clawing at her throat, and saw him over Rachel. Rachel was pinned to the floorboards, her arms locked in his iron grip. She wasn't screaming, she was silent, her mouth open in a soundless, terrified gasp. The man leaned down, his red hair falling forward like a curtain of gore. "No!" Sarah screamed, scrambled to her feet, heedless of the jagged wood digging into her palms. She threw herself at him, tackling him from behind, driving her shoulder into his back. He didn't budge. He felt like a statue of living marble. He threw his head back, catching Sarah in the face with his elbow. The impact sent a shockwave of stars across her vision. She hit the floor, tasting the salt of blood in her mouth. Through the blur, she saw it happen. The man leaned down, his posture arching with a primal, hungry elegance. He buried his face in the soft crook of Rachel's neck. Rachel's body went rigid. Her back arched, her heels drumming a frantic, dying beat against the floorboards. She let out a singular, choked sound, a sharp, high-pitched keening that tore through the attic and settled into the marrow of Sarah's bones. The man's shoulders heaved as he drank, a rhythmic, guttural intake of breath that sounded like water draining from a tub. "Rachel!" Sarah screamed again, her voice cracking. The man pulled back, his mouth stained with a bright, arterial spray that looked impossibly vivid in the dying moonlight. He turned his head slowly to look at Sarah, a cruel, satisfied smirk twisting his features. Rachel slumped, her eyes rolling back into her head, her skin turning the color of wet parchment. The man let her go, and she fell with a limp, terrifying heaviness, her head hitting the wood with a dull whack. The red-haired man rose, his movements loose and predatory. He flicked a drop of blood from his chin, his eyes locking onto Sarah's with a cold, possessive hunger. "Next," he whispered. The spell of terror shattered. The instinct to survive surged, overriding the grief, the shock, and the freezing horror of what she had seen. Sarah scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the floor, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gulps. She didn't look back at the attic, she couldn't. She bolted for the stairs. Her feet found the rotting steps by memory alone. She tumbled down them, a blur of motion and bruised limbs, hearing the heavy, measured thud of his boots right behind her. He wasn't running, he was hunting, savoring the chase. Sarah hit the hallway, the floorboards screaming under her feet. She didn't head for the front door. It was locked, bolted from the outside by forces she didn't understand. She threw herself toward the kitchen window, shattering the glass with her elbow. The shards bit into her skin, but she didn't feel the pain. She vaulted through the opening, the night air hitting her like a slap. She hit the overgrown grass of the yard, rolling to her feet, and sprinted into the dense, suffocating blackness of the island woods. Behind her, the house loomed, a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the night sky. She could hear nothing but the frantic thudding of her own heart and the wind tearing through the twisted, skeletal branches of the trees. She ran until her lungs burned like she'd inhaled live embers. She ran until the world became a blur of dark shapes and snagging thorns. She was lost, terrified, and fundamentally, irreparably broken. Rachel was gone. The girl who had laughed at urban legends was dead, replaced by the silence in the attic. And as Sarah stumbled into a clearing, her hands slick with her own blood and the glass shards still embedded in her skin, she looked back at the house. The upstairs window was dark, but a single silhouette stood there, still, watching, waiting for her to realize that there was no way off this island. There was no escape. There was only the hunger, and the long, endless night that had just begun to claim her. The air in the woods was thick enough to chew, a humid, suffocating soup that clung to Sarah's skin like a shroud. Every inhalation felt like dragging grit and decaying leaves into her lungs. Behind her, the attic, that house of teeth and shadows, was a silent monolith, but the silence was a lie. It was a predator holding its breath. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a knotted, skeletal root that snagged her ankle like a withered hand. She sprawled forward, palms slamming into the damp, rotted detritus of the forest floor. The impact jarred her teeth, and for a heartbeat, she didn't want to get up. The earth smelled of wet iron and ancient rot. Rachel. The name wasn't a thought, it was a physical blow to her chest. She could still see the way Mark's head had tilted, the sickening wet tear of skin, and the fountain of crimson that had painted the peeling wallpaper of the attic. Get up, she hissed at herself, the words emerging as a ragged, hysterical sob. Get up, get up, get up. She scrambled to her knees, her jeans torn at the shins, blood slicking her palms. She didn't look at it. She pushed off the ground, her lungs burning, and broke into a blind, desperate sprint. The trees here weren't just trees. They were gnarled, reaching limbs, their branches clawing at her clothes, snatching at her hair. She ran with the graceless, panicked gait of someone who knew that whatever was behind her didn't need to run. It had all the time in the world. She reached the perimeter of the clearing, the darkness of the woods thickening as the moon struggled to pierce the canopy. Her phone, the thin, glowing lifeline in her pocket, felt heavy as a stone. She yanked it out, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it into the muck. No signal. No, 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 she gasped, weaving around a thick oak, nearly tripping again. She held the device toward the sky, praying for a single bar, a glimmer of connectivity. Nothing. The island was a dead zone in every sense of the word. She heard a sound then, not a footstep, but a shift. A subtle, rhythmic rustle of leaves that didn't match the wind. It was purposeful. Calculated. Sarah ducked behind the wide, moss-slicked trunk of a willow, pressing her back against the bark. She held her breath, her chest heaving, the sound of her own heartbeat deafening in her ears. Thump thump. Thump thump. It sounded like a drum signaling her position to the shadows. She peeked around the side of the trunk. 50 yards away, standing perfectly still in the middle of the narrow dirt path, was a silhouette. It wasn't Mark. This one was taller, thinner, a spindly shadow that seemed to ripple at the edges like heat haze. It stood motionless, head tilted at an impossible, bird-like angle, listening. Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth, biting down on her own skin until she tasted copper. Don't move. Don't breathe. The figure shifted, its limbs moving with a jarring, twitchy fluidity. It turned toward the spot where Sarah stood. It didn't have eyes, or if it did, they weren't catching the moonlight. It was just a hollow, hungry shape. The terror that had been a frantic, bubbling soup in her stomach suddenly cooled, hardening into a jagged, glacial resolve. She wasn't just a girl in the woods anymore. She was prey. And she had two choices: die in the dirt here, or keep moving until she hit the lake. She lowered her hand, her breathing shallow and controlled now, though her hand still shook. She picked up a heavy, jagged rock from the base of the tree. It was a useless weapon against a creature that could rip through a man like wet paper, but it was something. She waited until the creature took a step into the thicket, its head snapping toward a rustle of wind-blown brush. Sarah bolted. She didn't run with the caution of a hiker. She ran with the desperate, jagged velocity of someone sprinting away from the end of the world. Her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and every stride sent a jolt of pain through her bruised ankle, but she didn't slow. She could hear it behind her now, not running, but gliding. A low, wet whistling sound, like air being sucked through a collapsed throat. The lake. Just get to the lake. She burst through a line of dense, thorny undergrowth, the barbs tearing at her jacket and skin, leaving long, weeping welts on her arms. She ignored them. She saw the glimmer of black water ahead, the lake, the dark, stagnant expanse that separated her from the life she had lived just hours ago. She scanned the shoreline, her heart plummeting. The boat. Where was the boat? They had moored it to a rotted wooden piling, a jagged tooth of timber sticking out of the water. It was empty. The ropes were gone, the wood splintered as if something had snapped the line with massive, singular force. No, she whimpered, backing away from the water's edge. No, please. She spun around, scanning the tree line. The woods were silent again. Too silent. The wind had died, and the forest seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. She reached into her pocket again, a frantic, compulsive motion. If she could just get one message out, one text to the police, to her parents, to anyone, they would know. Even if she died, someone would come to this god-forsaken rock. She tapped the screen, her thumb bloody. Emergency. The screen flickered. A single bar of service pulsed, ghostly and pale. She began to type, her fingers clumsy and frantic. Island. House. Rachel. They're here. There. A cold, heavy pressure clamped down on her shoulder. It wasn't a hand. It felt like a clamp made of dry, frozen bone. The smell hit her then, stale perfume, grave dirt, and the cloying, sweet rot of something that had been dead for a very long time. Sarah didn't scream. The sound died in her throat, strangled by the sheer, overwhelming reality of her situation. She slowly turned her head, the movement agonizingly stiff. Standing behind her was not the spindly creature, but a woman in a tattered, Victorian-era dress, her skin the color of curdled milk. Her eyes were sunken, dark pits of absolute, predatory hunger. She smiled, revealing teeth that were serrated and needle-sharp. "You're not supposed to leave, dear," the woman whispered, her voice like grinding stones. "The cycle has just begun." Sarah lashed out, swinging the heavy rock with every ounce of strength left in her body. It connected with the woman's temple with a dull thud, and the entity stumbled back, her head snapping to the side. Sarah didn't wait to see if she fell. She hurled herself into the lake. The water was freezing, a sudden, numbing shock that stole the breath from her lungs. She dove deep, her clothes weighing her down, the darkness of the lake swallowing her whole. She swam with manic, thrashing strokes, her eyes burning as she looked up through the murk toward the distant, faint moonlight. She breached the surface 10 yards out, gasping for air, her muscles screaming. She looked back at the shore. The woman was standing at the water's edge, watching her. She wasn't trying to follow. She just stood there, motionless, a sentinel of the dark. Sarah turned toward the opposite bank, the town, the lights that looked like distant, untouchable stars. She began to swim, the freezing water numbing her limbs, but she didn't care. She was a witness. She was a survivor. And for the first time in her life, she felt the terrifying, cold weight of a truth that wouldn't let her go. She was leaving the girl she loved on this island, and as she stroked through the black water, she realized with a sickening clarity, she wasn't just swimming away from the island. She was swimming away from the version of herself that thought the world was a safe place. The nightmare wasn't staying on the island. As she reached the far bank and dragged herself onto the muddy, shivering ground, she knew, with the instinct of the hunted, that she would be bringing it home with her.